My son tried to steal $2.5 million from me, and he almost got away with it because he thought I was just a grieving old widow who didn't know any better. My name is Catherine Brennan. I'm 73 years old, and after 52 years of marriage to my beloved Thomas, I thought I knew everything about the man who shared my bed, my dreams, and my morning coffee for over half a century. We built a good life together here in Sacramento. He was a mechanic with hands that could fix anything. I was a nurse for 38 years who believed in taking care of people. We raised our son Marcus, saved our money the old-fashioned way, and I trusted that when my time came to be alone, the people I loved would take care of me the way I'd taken care of everyone else my whole life. I was wrong. When Thomas died 3 months ago, sudden heart attack at 75, there one morning making me pancakes, gone by afternoon, I thought my biggest challenge would be learning to sleep in an empty bed and figuring out how to file taxes by myself. I never imagined I'd have to fight my own son for the right to honor my husband's final gift to me. You see, Thomas left me more than just our house and our savings. He left me a secret that took him 14 years to create, hidden in a rundown garage across town that he never, not once, in 5 decades, let me set foot inside. When I finally walked through that rusty door with the keys his lawyer handed me, I understood why my boy Marcus was so eager to help his confused old mother sell that worthless property as fast as possible. They thought 73 years had made me weak and simple. They were about to learn that age doesn't make you stupid, it makes you dangerous, because you've got nothing left to lose and a lifetime of wisdom to guide you. Subscribe to hear how a widow with arthritis in her hands and steel in her spine fought back against the people who should have protected her most. This is my story, and I'm going to tell you every last detail of how I made sure my Thomas's love wasn't stolen by greed. You know, when you've been married for 52 years, you think you know a person's habits better than they know themselves. Thomas had his routines: coffee at 5:30, workshop time after dinner, Sunday drives to nowhere in particular. But that garage across town was the one thing he kept completely separate from our life together. For 5 decades, every time I asked about visiting his workspace, Thomas would get this gentle but firm look and tell me it was just a mess of old car parts and rusty tools, nothing I'd want to see. He'd pat my hand and say, "Cat, honey, it's dirty and disorganized. You'd hate it." And because I loved him and trusted him completely, I let it go. Men need their spaces, I figured. Lord knows I had my sewing room where he wasn't allowed to touch anything. But the morning Thomas died, something felt different about how Marcus and Jennifer reacted when the lawyer mentioned the garage property. I was sitting in Paul Davidson's office 3 days after the funeral, still wearing the black dress that smelled like funeral flowers, trying to focus on words like probate and estate inventory, when my world was spinning off its axis. Paul read through Thomas's assets methodically: our house worth about $400,000, our savings accounts, his life insurance. Then he mentioned the commercial property on Industrial Boulevard, and I watched my son's face change. Just for a second, but I caught it. Marcus sat up straighter, and Jennifer squeezed his hand in a way that didn't look like comfort. It looked like a signal. "What exactly is in that garage, Paul?" I asked, because suddenly I needed to know. "Thomas wanted you to see it yourself before making any decisions, Catherine. He was very specific about that in his instructions." That's when Marcus jumped in, smooth as silk. "Mom, you don't need to worry about that old place. Dad always said it was just junk and broken down equipment. In your state right now, the last thing you need is dealing with some dusty warehouse full of rusty car parts. In my state, like grief had made me incompetent, we could handle selling it for you," Jennifer added, leaning forward with that concerned daughter-in-law expression I'd seen her practice in family photos. "Marcus knows about these things. You shouldn't have to deal with real estate transactions right now." Paul cleared his throat. "Actually, Thomas left specific instructions that Catherine should inspect the property personally before any decisions are made. He was quite insistent about that." I watched Marcus's jaw tighten just slightly. "Well, of course, if Mom wants to see it, but honestly, in this market, industrial properties in that neighborhood aren't worth much. We should probably list it quickly before property taxes become a burden." Property taxes on a property Thomas had maintained for decades without ever mentioning financial strain. Something cold settled in my stomach. "I'd like those keys now, Paul," I said quietly. The ride home was full of Marcus and Jennifer's helpful suggestions. They could drive me to the garage tomorrow. They could contact a real estate agent they knew. They could handle the whole thing so I wouldn't have to stress about it during my adjustment period. But that night, lying in the bed where Thomas should have been beside me, I kept thinking about that look that passed between them, about how quickly they wanted to dispose of a property they claimed was worthless, about how my son, who'd been calling me twice a week for years, suddenly thought I was too fragile to handle my own affairs. 52 years of marriage teaches you to read people, and 38 years of nursing teaches you to trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right. The feeling in my gut told me that my son knew something about that garage that I didn't, and for the first time since Thomas died, I felt something besides grief. I felt the sharp, clear sensation that I was being lied to by the person I'd raised to always tell me the truth. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to that garage alone, before Marcus could help me see it through his eyes. Because something told me that what Thomas had hidden from me for 50 years wasn't shame about a messy workshop. It was protection of something valuable enough that my own son was willing to lie to his grieving mother to get his hands on it. I drove to that garage on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral, with my hands shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. Not from grief this time, from anger. Because the night before, I'd done something I never thought I'd do in my 73 years on this earth. I'd searched through my own son's things. Marcus had left his laptop open on my kitchen table while he went to the store to pick up groceries for Mom. I told myself I was just moving it so I could set down my coffee cup. But when the screen lit up and I saw an email thread with the subject line, Mom's Garage Property, something in my chest went cold. The emails went back 6 months. 6 months before Thomas died. Marcus writing to Jennifer about Dad's old garage that Mom doesn't know the real value of. Jennifer responding about waiting for the right time and making sure Catherine doesn't get any independent appraisals. An email from someone named Rick Morrison, dated 2 weeks after Thomas's funeral, confirming he could handle the estate sale discreetly and mentioning a $50,000 cash offer, no questions asked. $50,000 for a property they wanted me to sell immediately before I could think clearly. But it was the last email that made my blood run cold. Marcus had written to Jennifer just 5 days ago. Mom's more confused since Dad died than I expected. She keeps asking weird questions about the garage. We need to move fast on the sale before she starts getting suspicious or talks to the wrong people. Rick says he can close in a week if we bring him the keys. More confused since Dad died. Like my questions were symptoms of mental decline, rather than the natural curiosity of a woman trying to understand her late husband's affairs. I'd raised this boy, changed his diapers, stayed up with him through fevers, taught him to drive, walked him down the aisle to marry Jennifer. And he was discussing my supposed mental incompetence with his wife, like I was a problem to be managed rather than his mother who deserved honesty. So when I pulled up to that garage on Industrial Boulevard, my hands weren't shaking from grief anymore. They were shaking from the fury of a woman who'd just discovered that the people she trusted most in the world saw her as an obstacle to overcome. The building looked exactly like Marcus had described, run-down brick exterior, faded paint, windows so dirty you couldn't see through them. If I hadn't known better, I would have agreed it looked worthless. But Thomas had maintained this property for decades. My husband, who wouldn't spend $5 on himself without calculating if we needed it elsewhere, had kept paying for this building every month for 50 years. I fumbled with the keys Paul had given me, trying 3 different ones before the heavy door finally opened with a groan that echoed through the morning air. And then I stepped inside, and my world exploded. It wasn't a garage. It was a showroom that belonged in a museum. 6 automobiles sat under perfect lighting like jewels in a crown, each one pristine, gleaming, positioned with the care of someone who understood beauty. A 1967 Corvette in cherry red that looked like it had rolled off the assembly line yesterday. A 1965 Mustang in metallic blue that took my breath away. Cars I'd only seen in magazines or movies, each one absolutely perfect. I walked between them on legs that felt like water, these old hands reaching out to touch chrome that reflected my stunned face back at me. Each car had a small placard, restored by Thomas Brennan, with dates spanning from 2010 to just 3 months before he died. My Thomas. My husband who'd told me he was just tinkering with old parts in his spare time. Who'd spent 14 years of evenings and weekends secretly creating this palace of automotive art, while I thought he was sorting through rusty tools and old engine blocks. In the corner sat a pristine workshop with tools organized like surgical instruments, and a small office that looked like it belonged to a professional restoration business. I found myself walking toward that office like I was sleepwalking, because nothing about this made sense with the man I thought I'd known for over 5 decades. The desk drawers were unlocked. Inside, I found folders organized with the precision Thomas brought to everything he cared about: insurance documents, maintenance records, and then a folder labeled for Catherine in his careful handwriting. Inside were professional appraisals dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's heart attack, each car evaluated by certified automotive specialists. The numbers made me sit down hard in Thomas's desk chair because my legs simply gave out. $2,400,000. The 6 cars together were worth more than 5 times everything Thomas and I had saved in our entire working lives. But there was more. Purchase offers from collectors across the country, contracts with prestigious auction houses, communications with specialty dealers who'd been begging Thomas to sell. This wasn't just a hobby that had gotten out of hand. This was a carefully planned investment that my husband had been building for our future. And at the bottom of the folder, an envelope with my name on it in Thomas's shaky handwriting from his final weeks. The letter inside made me understand exactly why Marcus had been so eager to help his poor, confused mother dispose of this worthless property before she could think clearly, because my son had known. Somehow, Marcus had discovered what was in this garage, and he'd been planning to steal every penny of it while convincing me I was too addled by grief to understand what I was giving away. They thought age had made me helpless. They thought widowhood had made me stupid. They thought that 73 years of life had left me too weak to protect what my husband had built for me. They were about to learn that underestimating a woman who'd survived the Great Depression, raised children through the Cold War, and buried her parents, her siblings, and now her husband, was the biggest mistake they could possibly make. The letter from Thomas was written in his careful handwriting, the kind he used for important documents, not grocery lists. My hands trembled as I read words that felt like he was speaking to me from beyond the grave. My dearest Cat, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you've found my surprise. These cars were going to be our golden years, the trips we always talked about, that European cruise you wanted, maybe a little house by the ocean. I'm sorry I kept it secret, but I wanted it to be perfect before I showed you. Don't let anyone tell you they're worth less than they are. Paul knows the best appraisers. I love you forever. Your Tom. I sat in that office for an hour, crying for the husband who'd spent 14 years secretly building our dream retirement while I'd been complaining about him spending too much time playing with old cars. But when the tears stopped, something harder settled in their place. I needed to know exactly how much Marcus knew, and I needed to find out without letting him realize I'd discovered his game. So I did something that would have horrified my younger self. I started lying to my own son. When Marcus called that evening to check on me, his daily welfare check, as he'd started calling it since the funeral I played the part he expected, I told him I'd driven by the garage but hadn't gone inside because the key stuck and I'd gotten frustrated. That I was thinking maybe he was right about selling it quickly because dealing with property maintenance seemed overwhelming. That I trusted his judgment because all these legal and financial decisions were so confusing for someone like me. Someone like me, a woman whose nursing career had required making life and death decisions under pressure for nearly 4 decades, who'd managed our household finances for 50 years, who'd handled Thomas's medical care through 2 surgeries and a diabetic crisis. But suddenly, according to my son, grief had made me incapable of understanding basic real estate. Marcus's relief was so obvious I could hear it through the phone. He told me he'd been thinking the same thing, that I shouldn't stress myself with complicated property decisions. During my adjustment period, he'd already talked to that real estate contact of his, Rick Morrison, who could handle everything quickly and quietly. Quietly was an interesting word choice for a legitimate transaction. The next morning, I called Paul Davidson and told him I needed to meet somewhere private, not his office, where Marcus might see my car in the parking lot. We met at a small cafe downtown where I'd never run into family, and I laid out everything I'd discovered. Paul's face went gray as I described the emails, the lowball offers, Marcus's eagerness to sell before I could get confused by too much information. When I finished, Paul sat back in his chair and looked every one of his 68 years. He told me that, 6 months before Thomas died, Marcus had shown up at the garage somehow. Paul never found out how he'd gotten access and had seen the cars, Instead of telling me about Thomas's amazing secret, Marcus had approached Paul privately with an offer to help Mom handle the estate when the time came. He'd suggested that $50,000 would be a fair price for that old garage, considering the neighborhood and the condition of the building. Paul had told Thomas immediately, and my husband had been devastated. Not just angry, devastated that the son he'd raised would try to cheat his own mother out of her inheritance. Thomas had forbidden Marcus from the property and made Paul promise to ensure I saw everything before making any decisions. Catherine, Paul said quietly, Thomas was worried about this exact scenario. He loved Marcus, but he'd seen changes in him over the years, the way Marcus talked about money, about what he was owed as an only child. Thomas wanted to protect you, but he also hoped that when the time came, Marcus would do the right thing. The right thing. My son could have called me the day after Thomas's funeral and said, Mom, Dad left you something incredible that's going to secure your future. Instead, he'd chosen to manipulate a grieving widow into giving away millions. I asked Paul to arrange for independent appraisers. People Marcus didn't know to evaluate the cars properly. I needed documentation that couldn't be questioned or dismissed as the confused thinking of an old woman, but I also needed to keep playing my role until I had all my facts straight. So when Marcus and Jennifer came for Sunday dinner, that Wicca tradition I'd maintained even through my grief because family was family, had performed the part of the befuddled widow to perfection. I mentioned how overwhelming all the paperwork was becoming, how grateful I was for their help with the complicated decisions. I said I'd tried to look at the garage but found it too dusty and depressing, exactly what Thomas had always warned me about. I wondered aloud if Marcus was right about selling quickly, before winter made the building even less appealing to buyers. Marcus leaned forward with that concerned expression he'd perfected, telling me he understood how hard all this was for me. He'd already spoken to Rick Morrison, who could take care of everything. No need for me to deal with inspections or negotiations or any of the stressful parts of selling property. Jennifer nodded sympathetically, patting my hand like I was a child who needed comfort. She mentioned how important it was for me to focus on my health and emotional healing, rather than business complications I didn't really understand. As if 38 years of managing a nursing career while raising a family and handling our finances had taught me nothing about evaluating important decisions. But I smiled and nodded and let them believe their performance was working. I served them Thomas's favorite pot roast and listened to them plan my financial future while I planned something entirely different. Because they'd made one crucial mistake in their assessment of Catherine Brennan. They thought age and grief had made me weak and gullible. Actually, they'd made me patient and strategic and absolutely ruthless. By the time they left that evening, kissing my cheek and promising to take care of everything for their poor, overwhelmed mother, I'd already scheduled appointments with 3 different automotive appraisers for the following week. They thought they were protecting a confused old woman from making bad decisions. I was about to show them what a woman with 7 decades of life experience could do when she finally decided to stop being nice. The automotive appraisers I hired were professionals who dealt with serious collectors, not small-town real estate flippers trying to make a quick profit off someone's grief. When 3 separate experts walked through that garage and came back with evaluations ranging from $2.4 to $2.8 million, I realized that Marcus wasn't just being greedy, he was planning the theft of a lifetime. But I needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went, and more importantly, who else might be involved. The first clue came when I was playing my helpless widow act during Marcus's daily check-in call. I mentioned casually that I'd been thinking about what Thomas Mative might have wanted me to do with his old car parts, wondering aloud if he'd had any special plans for them. Marcus's response was immediate and revealing. He told me not to worry about Dad's unrealistic dreams for those old vehicles, that Thomas had always been overly sentimental about cars, probably imagining they were worth more than they actually were. That it was important for me to be practical now, rather than getting caught up in Thomas's fantasies. My husband had spent 14 years methodically researching, purchasing, and professionally restoring automobiles that were now worth nearly $3 million, and Marcus was dismissing it as the foolish sentiment of an old man who didn't understand real value. The second clue came from Jennifer during what had become her weekly wellness visits, checking on poor Catherine to make sure she was eating properly and not getting confused about important matters. She brought up the garage property without any prompting from me. mentioning how sad it was that Thomas had spent so much time on that hobby instead of enjoying his retirement. That hobby, like the careful craftsmanship that had created museum-quality restorations, was just an old man's way of avoiding reality. But it was the third clue that made me understand the true scope of what I was dealing with. I'd been wondering how Marcus had originally gained access to the garage, since Thomas had been so careful about keeping it private. So I did something that probably would have shocked my Sunday school friends. I went through Marcus's phone while he was in my bathroom during one of his visits. What I found in his photo gallery made my blood pressure spike so high I had to sit down. Pictures of the cars, taken months before Thomas died. Date stamps showing Marcus had been inside that garage in February, a full month before Thomas's heart attack. But these weren't casual snapshots of someone who'd stumbled onto a family secret. These were detailed photographs of every angle of every vehicle, close-ups of the restoration work, images of the documentation Thomas kept in his files, pictures taken by someone who was cataloging assets for future sale. Scrolling further back, I found something even worse. Screenshots of text messages between Marcus and someone named Derek Chen, discussing vintage automotive liquidation and private estate sales that bypassed normal auction channels. Messages about moving quickly before family members complicate the process, and older sellers who don't understand current market values. Marcus wasn't just planning to steal my inheritance. He was part of some kind of network that specifically targeted elderly people who might not understand the value of what they owned. The final piece fell into place when I found an email Marcus had forwarded to Jennifer, sent by this Derek Chen person. It contained a detailed breakdown of what he called their standard approach for simplified estate transitions. Step 1. Identify elderly owners who might not be aware of their assets' true value. Step 2. Establish trust by offering to help with overwhelming paperwork and decisions. Step 3. Arrange quick sales to trusted buyers at below market prices. Step 4. Split the difference between the actual value and the sale price among the helpers who facilitated the transaction. They had a system, a practiced routine for cheating grieving widows and elderly people who trusted their families to protect them. I realized I wasn't just Marcus's target, I was his practice run for a larger operation. The son I'd raised was using his dying father's work and his grieving mother's trust as training for a business built on exploiting vulnerable older people. That night, I sat in Thomas's chair in our living room, looking at the framed photo of Marcus's college graduation, where he'd thanked his parents for teaching him the importance of honesty and hard work. I'd been so proud of the man we'd raised. Now I was staring at evidence that he'd turned those lessons inside out, using our trust in him as a weapon against everything we'd valued. But understanding the depth of Marcus's betrayal also revealed something else. He wasn't just underestimating me because I was his mother. He was underestimating me because his entire scheme depended on older people being too confused, too trusting, or too overwhelmed to fight back effectively. He'd built his strategy around the assumption that people my age would be grateful for someone younger to handle complicated decisions for them, that we'd be so relieved to have help that we wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about why the help was so urgently needed. Marcus had forgotten something important about the generation that survived the Depression, World War II, and the Cold War. We didn't get through all that by being helpless. We got through it by being tougher than anyone expected us to be. And now, for the first time since Thomas died, I wasn't just angry about being betrayed. I was excited about proving exactly how tough Catherine Brennan could be when someone threatened what mattered to her. Because Marcus wasn't just stealing money. He was stealing the final love letter my husband had spent 14 years writing to me. And that was a mistake that was going to cost him everything. The question wasn't whether I was going to fight back. The question was how completely I was going to destroy the business model that depended on people like me being too weak to protect ourselves. I've learned over 7 decades that when someone underestimates you, the smartest thing you can do is let them keep believing their own assumptions while you gather everything you need to prove them wrong. So while Marcus and Jennifer continued their performance of caring for their confused, overwhelmed mother, I spent the next 2 weeks building a case that would be impossible for them to dismiss or manipulate. The first thing I needed was documentation that couldn't be questioned. Paul Davidson connected me with Margaret Winters, a forensic accountant who specialized in estate fraud. Apparently, what Marcus was planning wasn't as uncommon as I'd hoped. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 50s who, listened to my story without a trace of the condescension I'd been getting from my own family. She helped me gather evidence that went far beyond the cars themselves. Bank records showing the money Thomas had invested in restoration parts and professional services over 14 years, insurance policies he'd maintained on each vehicle, professional correspondence with auction houses and collectors, a complete paper trail proving that Thomas's hobby was actually a carefully planned investment strategy. But Margaret also uncovered something I hadn't expected. Thomas had been keeping detailed records of every conversation he'd had with Marcus about the garage, including the confrontation 6 months before he died. My husband had documented Marcus's exact words when he'd offered to help Mom avoid the stress of dealing with worthless property. Thomas had even recorded the phone call where Marcus had suggested that $50,000 would be generous for that old building with junk cars in it. Junk cars. My son had stood in that garage, surrounded by nearly $3 million worth of pristine automotive artistry, and called them junk to their creator's face. The second resource I needed was allies, people who understood the situation and couldn't be swayed by Marcus's charm or convinced that I was too emotional to think clearly. Through Margaret, I met Robert Santos, a retired police detective who now worked in asset recovery. Robert had seen enough family financial fraud to recognize the pattern immediately. He helped me understand the legal implications of what Marcus was planning. If I'd sold those cars for $50,000 without knowing their real value, it wouldn't technically be theft, it would be fraud by deception. Marcus could have claimed he'd genuinely believed the cars were worthless, that he was just trying to help his grieving mother avoid complicated decisions. Without proof of his knowledge of their true value, any legal action would have come down to my word against his. But the photos on his phone and the text messages with Derek Chen changed everything. That was evidence of deliberate deception and conspiracy to defraud. Robert helped me document everything properly, with timestamps and screenshots that would hold up in court if necessary. The third resource I secured was the most satisfying. Through Robert's contacts in the automotive world, I connected with James Mitchell, who ran one of the most prestigious classic car auction houses on the West Coast. James had actually been in communication with Thomas for 2 years, trying to convince him to consign the collection for auction. When James came to evaluate the cars personally, his reaction was everything I'd needed to see. He walked through that garage like he was touring a cathedral, stopping to examine details of Thomas's restoration work with genuine reverence. He told me that finding 6 vehicles of this quality, all restored by the same craftsman, was incredibly rare. The collection wasn't just valuable, it was historically significant. James offered to handle the sale through his auction house, guaranteeing a minimum of $2.6 million and projecting a final sale price closer to $3 million. He also offered something else that I hadn't expected: the opportunity to tell Thomas's story as part of the auction marketing, the dedication, the craftsmanship, the love that had gone into creating this collection. My husband's legacy wouldn't just be preserved, it would be celebrated by people who understood what he'd accomplished. But the most important resource I gathered wasn't financial or legal documentation. It was clarity about what I was really fighting for. Marcus and his network of fraudsters were targeting people like me because they assumed that age made us vulnerable, that grief made us grateful for any help, even help that wasn't in our best interest, that we'd be so overwhelmed by complicated decisions that we'd hand over control to anyone who seemed confident and competent. They were building a business model on the assumption that older people were easy marks for financial manipulation. Every time I let that sink in, I got angrier, not just about what Marcus was planning to do to me, but about what he and Derek Chen were probably doing to other families. How many other widows had been convinced to sell valuable assets for fractions of their worth because they trusted someone who claimed to be helping them? How many other Thomas Brennans had spent years building something beautiful for the people they loved, only to have it stolen by relatives who saw inheritance as an opportunity rather than a responsibility? That's when I realized this wasn't just about protecting my own inheritance anymore. It was about proving that people my age weren't helpless victims waiting to be rescued by younger people who thought they knew better. It was about showing Marcus and everyone like him that underestimating a 73-year-old woman with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous mistake they could possibly make. The evidence was gathered, the allies were in place, the legal protections were secured. Now, all I needed was the perfect moment to spring the trap that would teach my son exactly how much his mother had learned about protecting herself in 7 decades of life, because Marcus had made one final miscalculation in his assessment of Catherine Brennan. He thought that losing Thomas had made me weak and dependent. Actually, losing Thomas had made me absolutely fearless. The opportunity I'd been waiting for came in the most perfectly ironic way possible. Marcus called me on a Thursday evening in late November, his voice full of that helpful concern I'd grown to despise, telling me he had great news about the garage property. His contact Rick Morrison was ready to close on the sale immediately, $55,000, $5,000 more than the original offer, which Marcus presented like he'd negotiated some kind of victory for his poor old mother. Rick could handle all the paperwork, transferred the deed, and have a check in my hands by Monday. No inspections, no complications, no need for me to even visit the property again. Isn't that wonderful, Mom? You won't have to worry about that old building anymore, and you'll have some extra money to make your life more comfortable. More comfortable. Like $55,000 was a windfall that would change my circumstances, rather than roughly 2% of what my husband had actually left me. But it was what Marcus said next that gave me the opening I needed. He mentioned that he'd already arranged for Rick to clear out any old junk from the building after the sale, saving me the emotional difficulty of dealing with Thomas's broken-down project cars. Just like Dad would have wanted, Marcus assured me Thomas never would have expected me to handle disposing of old automotive parts that probably couldn't even be sold for scrap. That's when I knew exactly how to spring my trap. I told Marcus how grateful I was for his thoughtfulness, how overwhelming it had been to think about dealing with all those complicated details myself. I said I'd been worried about what to do with Thomas's old cars, but if Rick was willing to handle that as part of the sale, it seemed like the perfect solution. Then I delivered the line I'd been rehearsing. I just want to see the garage one more time before we sign everything, to say goodbye to Dad's workspace and maybe take a few photos from my memory book. Would you and Jennifer come with me on Saturday? I think I'd feel better having family there. Marcus agreed immediately, probably relieved that I wasn't asking difficult questions about valuations or market assessments, just a sentimental old woman wanting to take a few pictures before moving on with her life. Perfect. I spent Friday making final preparations. Margaret Winters would be positioned across the street with recording equipment, perfectly legal since the garage was my property. Robert Santos would be nearby with a photographer who specialized in documenting valuable collections. James Mitchell from the auction house would arrive 30 minutes after Marcus and Jennifer, at my signal, to provide professional verification of everything I was about to reveal. I also invited one more person to this little gathering, Paul Davidson, who'd been Thomas's lawyer and witness to everything Marcus had said and done over the past 6 months. Paul would bring copies of every document, every email, every piece of evidence that proved exactly how long my son had been planning this theft. But the most important preparation I made was emotional. I spent Friday evening sitting in Thomas's chair, looking through photo albums from Marcus's childhood. Pictures of him learning to ride a bike, graduating from high school, walking down the aisle at his wedding. Moments when I'd been so proud of the man we were raising, so confident that we'd taught him the difference between right and wrong. I needed to look at those pictures one more time before I destroyed the relationship with my only child forever, because there would be no coming back from what I was going to do on Saturday morning. Once I revealed what I knew about Marcus's plans, once I exposed his involvement with Derek Chin's fraud network, once I proved that he'd been manipulating his grieving mother for financial gain, our family would never be the same. Part of me hoped that when confronted with the evidence, Marcus would break down and confess, that he'd explain how he'd gotten involved with these people, how the plan had spiraled beyond what he'd originally intended, how sorry he was for betraying everything Thomas and I had taught him. But a larger part of me, the part that had spent 2 months watching him lie to my face while planning to steal my inheritance, knew better. Marcus had chosen this path deliberately, methodically, with full knowledge of what he was taking from me. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a bad decision made under pressure. This was who my son had become when he thought no one was watching. Saturday morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of November day that makes you grateful for warm houses and hot coffee. I dressed carefully, not in the confused widow costume I'd been playing for Marcus, but in the navy blue suit I'd worn 2 important nursing meetings, the one that made me feel competent and authoritative, I was done pretending to be helpless. Marcus and Jennifer arrived at my house at 10 o'clock. Bringing coffee and pastries like this was a family outing instead of the final scene in a 2-month deception. Marcus was relaxed, chatty, already talking about how nice it would be for me to have closure on this chapter of dealing with Dad's affairs. Jennifer was equally cheerful, mentioning how proud Thomas would be that I was handling everything so well, that I was making such practical decisions about moving forward with my life. They had no idea they were about to walk into the most expensive lesson of their lives about underestimating Catherine Brennan. As we drove toward Industrial Boulevard, Marcus kept up a steady stream of reassuring conversation about the sale, about Rick Morrison's reliability, about how this was exactly the kind of decision Thomas would have supported. I sat in the passenger seat, nodding and smiling, while inside my chest something hard and cold settled into place, the last trace of hope that my son might do the right thing when given the chance. By noon today, Marcus would understand that his mother wasn't a confused old woman who needed protection from complicated decisions. I was a 73-year-old force of nature who'd spent 2 months letting him think he was smarter than me. And now I was about to show him exactly how much that assumption was going to cost him. When Marcus pulled into the parking area in front of that garage at 11:30 on Saturday morning, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced since Thomas died, the absolute certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. I watched my son's face as he looked at the building, probably calculating how quickly Rick Morrison could strip out those worthless old cars and flip the property for its real value. Jennifer was already taking pictures with her phone, documenting what she thought would be the last time the confused old widow would have to deal with this emotional burden. They had no idea they were about to receive the education of their lives. I had my keys ready, but I let Marcus take them and unlock the door like the helpful son he'd been pretending to be. I wanted him to be the one to open that door. I wanted him to walk into that garage first, with his wife beside him, thinking they were humoring their elderly mother through one final sentimental visit before collecting their biggest payday. The moment that door swung open and the automatic lights illuminated Thomas's collection, I watched $55,000 worth of lies crumble in real time. Marcus stopped so suddenly that Jennifer bumped into him from behind. I heard her sharp intake of breath, saw her hand fly to her mouth. For 30 seconds, neither of them said a word, just stood there staring at $2.8 million worth of automotive perfection gleaming under professional lighting. Marcus recovered first, spinning around to face me with an expression I'd never seen before, caught somewhere between shock and panic and something that looked almost like fear. He started talking fast, stumbling over words, trying to convince me that this didn't change anything, that these cars were still just old vehicles that would be expensive to maintain, difficult to sell, more trouble than they were worth for someone in my position. That Rick Morrison's offer was still the smart choice because it avoided all the complications of dealing with collectors and auction houses and specialized markets I wouldn't understand. I let him talk. I let him dig himself deeper with every word while I walked slowly between those cars, running my hands over chrome and paint that reflected the garage lights like mirrors. I let Jennifer add her voice to his, talking about how overwhelming this discovery must be for me. How grateful I should be that they were there to help me think through such a complicated situation. Then I heard the door open behind us, and Paul Davidson walked in with Margaret Winters and Robert Santos, followed by James Mitchell carrying a briefcase full of documentation that would destroy every lie Marcus had built over the past 2 months. That's when I finally spoke. I told Marcus and Jennifer to sit down in the folding chairs Paul had arranged in the office area, because we needed to have a conversation that was long overdue. I told them that for the past 2 months, I'd been playing the role of the confused, grateful widow because I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go with their plan to steal my inheritance. I watched the color drain from Marcus's face as I laid out everything I knew. The emails about moving fast before Mom got suspicious. The text messages with Derek Chen about targeting elderly sellers who didn't understand market values. The photographs he'd taken of these cars months before Thomas died, cataloging assets he planned to acquire through fraud. Jennifer tried to interrupt, claiming there had been some misunderstanding, that they'd only been trying to help me avoid stress during a difficult time. But I cut her off with a voice that carried 38 years of authority from managing medical emergencies. I told them about the professional appraisal street, separate evaluations confirming that Thomas's collection was worth between $2.6 and $3 million. I told them about James Mitchell's auction house, which had been trying to acquire these cars for over 2 years. I told them about the insurance policies Thomas had maintained, the documentation he'd kept, the careful records proving this wasn't a hobby that got out of hand but a deliberate investment strategy. Then, I showed them the folder containing Thomas's letter, the letter explaining that these cars were meant to be our dream retirement, the trips we'd planned, the security he'd wanted to provide for my final years, the letter that proved my husband had died thinking he was leaving me a legacy of love, not knowing his own son was planning to steal it. Marcus tried one more approach, claiming he'd genuinely believed the cars weren't worth much, that he'd been trying to spare me disappointment if they turned out to be worthless. But I pulled out his phone, the phone I'd borrowed while he was in my bathroom the week before, the phone from which Margaret had professionally extracted every deleted message and photo. I read aloud his conversation with Derek Chen about vintage automotive liquidation and older sellers who don't understand current market values. I showed him the screenshots proving he'd been inside this garage months before Thomas died, taking detailed photographs for someone who planned to steal what he was documenting. That's when Marcus finally dropped the pretense. He told me I was making a mistake, that I didn't understand how complicated selling vehicles like this would be, that I was too old to handle negotiations with collectors and auction houses, that he'd been trying to protect me from being taken advantage of by strangers who would manipulate my emotions and my grief. Too old, like 73 years of life experience had left me incapable of recognizing when I was being manipulated by the people I trusted most. I asked Marcus if he thought Thomas had been too old to understand what he was building in this garage, if he thought the man who'd spent 14 years researching, purchasing, and professionally restoring these automobiles had been too confused to understand their value. I asked him if he thought the mother who'd raised him, who'd worked as a nurse for nearly 4 decades making life and death decisions under pressure, who'd managed our family's finances for 50 years, was too stupid to recognize theft when it was happening right in front of her. And then I told him what was going to happen next. James Mitchell would handle the auction of 5 of the cars through his house, with proper marketing that would tell Thomas's story and honor his craftsmanship. The 6th car, the 1967 Corvette, that had been Thomas's pride and joy, was keeping. I'd moved to a house at Lake Tahoe with a garage where I could see it every day, where I could drive it on Sundays and feel my husband beside me. I told Marcus that I'd revised my will. Instead of inheriting the bulk of my estate, he would receive exactly what the law required and not 1 penny more. The rest would go to automotive restoration charities in Thomas's name, and to trust funds for my grandchildren that Marcus would never be able to touch. I told him that Robert Santos had forwarded evidence of the fraud network to the appropriate authorities, and that Derek Chen's simplified estate transition business was about to become very complicated indeed. And I told Marcus that our relationship, such as it was over, that I would not be filing criminal charges against him because I didn't want that burden on my grandchildren, but that I never wanted to see him again, that he'd traded his inheritance and his family for $55,000 that was never going to be his anyway. The silence in that garage was absolute. Marcus and Jennifer sat there looking like their world had collapsed, which it had. Margaret, Robert, and James looked like they'd just witnessed something they'd remember for the rest of their careers. Paul looked like he was finally seeing justice for his old friend Thomas, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete peace with a decision that honored both my husband's memory and my own dignity. Marcus tried one last manipulation, telling me I was making a terrible mistake, that I'd regret pushing away the only family I had left, that I'd be all alone without their support. I told him he was wrong about that too. I wasn't alone. I had Thomas's legacy, I had my self-respect, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that a 73-year-old woman had just taught her own son the most expensive lesson of his life about underestimating people based on their age. 6 months later, I'm sitting on the deck of my new house overlooking Lake Tahoe, watching the sunrise paint the water gold while I drink my morning coffee from the mug Thomas gave me for our 50th anniversary. Behind me, in the garage that came with this beautiful property I bought with the auction proceeds, sits a 1967 Corvette in cherry red that still makes my heart skip when I see it. The auction James Mitchell arranged brought in $2,800,000, more than even he had projected. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was watching a room full of serious collectors bid passionately for automobiles they recognized as masterpieces. Listening to James tell Thomas's story to an audience that understood exactly what my husband had accomplished. One buyer, a restoration specialist from Arizona, told me afterward that Thomas's work was museum quality, that finding 6 vehicles restored by the same craftsman to this standard was like discovering buried treasure. He asked if I'd consider donating documentation of Thomas's techniques to an automotive heritage foundation, so future restorers could learn from his methods. My husband's legacy wasn't just preserved, it was being passed on to people who would honor his craftsmanship for generations. The criminal investigation Robert Santos initiated led to Derek Chen's arrest and the discovery of a network that had defrauded elderly victims across 3 states out of nearly $4 million. Marcus wasn't charged. I kept my word about protecting my grandchildren from that burden, but his name appeared in enough legal documents that his reputation in our small community is permanently destroyed. Jennifer filed for divorce 4 months after our confrontation in the garage. She told people around town that she'd had no idea about Marcus's plans, that she'd been as shocked as anyone to discover what he was planning to do to his own mother. I don't know if that's true, but I no longer care. Some betrayals are so complete that the details of who knew what when stop mattering. My grandchildren, Marcus's kids, now 18, 16, and 14, have been calling me regularly since they learned what their father tried to do. They're old enough to understand the difference between helping family and stealing from family. Old enough to be ashamed of choices they didn't make, but that affected them anyway. The trust funds I established for them will pay for college and help them start their adult lives without any debt to Marcus's decisions. The most surprising development has been the letters I've received from other elderly people who heard about the case through news coverage or word of mouth. Widows and widowers sharing stories of family members who tried to manipulate them into making financial decisions that weren't in their best interests. Adult children who'd assumed their aging parents were too confused to handle their own affairs, when what those parents actually needed was respect for their experience and autonomy. 3 different people have asked me to speak at senior centers about recognizing financial manipulation and protecting assets during vulnerable times. Apparently, my story has become something of a cautionary tale about underestimating older people's ability to fight back when necessary. I never imagined that at 73, I'd become an advocate for elderly empowerment, but there's something satisfying about using the worst experience of my life to help other people avoid similar betrayals. The house I bought here at Lake Tahoe has become exactly what Thomas and I dreamed about for our retirement. It's smaller than our family home in Sacramento, but it has huge windows that frame the lake like a living painting, and a kitchen where I can see the water while I cook. I've learned to use the internet to video chat with friends from my nursing days, and I've joined a classic car club where other owners appreciate Sunday drives through mountain roads. On weekends, I take the Corvette out on Highway 50, windows down, feeling Thomas beside me in the passenger seat the way I always imagined we'd travel together. Sometimes I drive to small towns we never visited when he was alive, eating lunch in diners and exploring antique shops, having the retirement adventures we'd planned but never got to take together. The loneliness I expected to define my widowhood hasn't materialized the way I thought it would. I miss Thomas every day. I'll miss him until the day I die, but I don't feel abandoned or lost the way I feared I would. Maybe it's because I'm living in the house his love built, driving the car his craftsmanship restored, secure in my independence because of the legacy he created for me. Or maybe it's because discovering that I could protect myself and honor his memory at the same time gave me a kind of confidence I'd never had before, knowing that even at 73, even in grief, even when betrayed by people I trusted most, I could still be strong enough to fight for what mattered. Marcus has tried to contact me twice, once through Paul Davidson, asking if we could work things out as a family, and once directly, showing up at my old house in Sacramento before he learned I'd moved. I haven't responded to either attempt. Some bridges, once burned, shouldn't be rebuilt. Some lessons about consequences need to be permanent to have any meaning. But I think about him sometimes, wondering if he understands yet what he really lost. It wasn't just his inheritance, it was the chance to be the son Thomas believed he'd raised, opportunity to honor his father's memory instead of trying to profit from it. The relationship with a mother who would have shared everything she had if he'd simply been honest about what he needed. The money from the car auction has given me financial security I never expected to have, but the real gift Thomas left me was the proof that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something that can protect and provide even when the person who created it is gone. Every morning when I wake up in this house by the lake, I'm reminded that I'm living Thomas's final love letter to me, not just the cars he restored, but the independence he made possible, the security he provided, the confidence he gave me to handle whatever challenges life might bring. At 73, I'm not winding down toward the end of my story. I'm starting a new chapter, one where I understand my own strength and refuse to let anyone convince me I'm too old or too fragile to protect what matters to me. If you're watching this from wherever you are in the world, I hope you'll remember that age doesn't make us helpless, it makes us experienced. That grief doesn't make us confused, it makes us appreciate what's truly valuable. And that family isn't just about blood relations, it's about people who honor your dignity and support your autonomy, regardless of how many birthdays you've celebrated. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories like mine, because every grandmother, every grandfather, every person who's lived long enough to understand the difference between what looks valuable and what actually matters has a story worth telling. And drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. My love, knowing that Thomas's story and mine are reaching people everywhere who understand that wisdom doesn't have an expiration date. The sun is fully up now, turning the lake into a mirror that reflects the mountains and the sky. It's going to be a beautiful day for a drive in a red Corvette, with my husband's memory riding shotgun and my future stretching out ahead of me like an open road. Some stories end with revenge. Mine ends with redemption, independence, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing you fought for what mattered and won.